The neon vacancy sign hummed in the quiet night, its red glow bleeding into the mist that curled over the cracked asphalt. Henry Calloway stood behind the counter, turning the keys over in his palm. The motel was quiet. It was always quiet. Crimson Pines wasn't a place people stayed. It was a place people passed through. Except for room 13, that one was never empty, not once. Not in the 6 months he had been running this place, not in the 40 years before. His uncle had left him the motel in his will, a man he barely knew, an inheritance he never wanted. The paperwork had been clean, no debt, no outstanding payments. But the books were strange. Room 13 was always listed as occupied. There was no name, no payment. Just a standing reservation that renewed itself every single night. Henry had laughed the first time he saw it. A glitch, he figured. Some old error in the system that had never been fixed. But then he noticed something else. There was no key for room 13. He had a key for every other room. Even the ones that were never used, covered in dust, their doors barely touched. But room 13, nothing. And the door was always locked, not with a deadbolt, not with a chain, just locked, like it had never been meant to open. Frankie, the motel's handyman, had been there since the beginning, since before Henry's uncle died, before Henry was even born. And when Henry asked him about the room, Frankie just shook his head. "Don't open that door, boss." Henry scoffed. "What, is it haunted?" Frankie's face didn't change. His hands trembled, like the very thought of it made him sick. Haunted things can leave, Calloway. That room don't let go. Henry should have listened. He should have let the mystery stay buried. But he didn't, because curiosity is a terrible thing. It starts small, a whisper in the back of your head, a flicker of unease when you look at something that doesn't make sense. Then it grows, creeps in, until it's too late to turn back, until the thing you are looking at starts looking back. The first sign of something wrong came a few days later. A guest checked into room 12, a man named Paul Whitaker. Middle-aged, road-weary, just looking for a place to sleep. Nothing strange about him, nothing strange about the room. But the next morning, he was gone, not checked out, not packed up and left in the night. Just gone. His car was still there, his wallet was on the nightstand, but the sheets were pristine. The shower hadn't been used, and when Henry checked the security footage, Paul never entered the room. Henry rewound the footage 5 times. It showed Paul stepping up to the door, room key in hand. Then, just as he turned the handle, the camera glitched for exactly 1 second, and when the image returned, the door was closed, and Paul Whitaker was gone. The air felt different after that, thicker, like the walls were breathing. The hallways seemed longer. The lights flickered only when Henry was alone, and every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., the television in the lobby turned to static, no matter what channel it had been on, no matter if the TV was turned off. And behind the static, sometimes he heard whispering. Henry tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it was nothing. But then he checked the motel records, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. Paul Whitaker's name was never in the system. He had checked in, paid in cash, had the key. Henry had seen him, but there was no record of him, like he had never been there at all, like the motel itself had erased him, or something inside it. And then came the phone call. The motel landline hadn't worked in years. The wires were old, disconnected. Henry had never even heard it ring. But at exactly 3:13 a.m., as the TV flickered and the hallway lights dimmed, the front desk phone rang, sharp, loud, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. Henry didn't want to pick it up, but his hand moved anyway, like something was making him. He pressed the receiver to his ear, didn't say a word, didn't breathe. And on the other end of the line, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here, Henry." The line went dead. Henry's pulse slammed against his ribs. His grip on the phone was too tight. And in the silence that followed, he heard something else. From down the hall, the slow, rhythmic creak of a door opening, a door that was always locked. Henry turned his head. The hallway stretched out before him, dark, still, and at the very end, room 13. The door was open, just slightly, just enough to see inside. Henry's breath came fast now. His feet felt glued to the floor, the air around him pressed down, heavy, suffocating, like something was waiting, watching. And then, a shadow moved inside the room, not a normal shadow. Not the way a person moves in dim light. It was wrong. Too tall, too slow. Like it was stretching, like it was trying to become something else. The static from the TV grew louder, the lights dimmed.
And in the reflection of the motel's front window, Henry saw himself, standing at the counter, eyes wide, breath shaking, and behind him, in the reflection, a figure stood at the end of the hall, watching him, tall, motionless, and when Henry turned around, there was nothing there. The door to room 13 slowly closed, the lock clicked into place, the air settled, and Henry finally let himself breathe. He didn't know how long he stood there, didn't know how long it took for his heart to stop hammering, but eventually, he forced himself to move, to go back behind the counter, to pretend he hadn't just seen what he had seen. And when he sat down, hands trembling, sweat beading his skin, the motel ledger was open. A new name had been added to the guest list, a name Henry didn't recognize, and next to it, the date of check-in, but no date of check-out, because no one ever checked out. Not really. And Henry had a feeling he never would either. The motel felt different after that night. The air was wrong. The walls felt closer, and room 13 was watching him. Henry tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell himself it was nothing, tried to convince himself that what he saw wasn't real, but he felt it, deep inside, like a hook lodged beneath his ribs, pulling him closer. A whisper in the back of his mind, "Come see." And he did. It started small, walking by room 13 more often than before, pausing a second too long outside the door, listening for something, anything, the sound of breathing, the creak of a bed shifting, a whisper just beyond the threshold. Nothing, but the air was warm, like someone had just left, like someone was still there. Frankie caught him one night, standing outside the room, staring at the door like it would blink first. Frankie didn't say anything at first, didn't ask what Henry was doing, didn't need to. He just stood beside him. And then, voice low, he said, "You don't let it in, Calloway." Henry turned to him, frowning. "Let what in?" Frankie didn't look at him, didn't blink, just whispered, "The knowing." Then he walked away. Henry stood there for a long time, watching the door. His fingers itched to grab the handle, to open it, to prove that Frankie was wrong, that this was just a room, that it was all in his head. And then, one night, he broke. The whisper in his mind became too loud, the weight in his chest became too heavy, the pull became too strong, and Henry opened the door. It shouldn't have opened, not after months of being sealed, but the handle turned, easily, too easily, like something had been waiting for him. The door creaked wide, and Henry stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not mildew, not dust, not something rotten, something old, something preserved, like a room that had been frozen in time, a space that refused to decay or be forgotten. The room was perfect. The bed was made. The lamps were on. The nightstand was clean. No dust, no signs of life. And yet, the air was thick, like someone had just left, or like they were still here, watching, waiting. Henry swallowed hard. Something about the walls felt wrong, like they were too close, like they were breathing. And then, the phone rang. Henry's body locked. The old rotary phone on the nightstand, the one that shouldn't work, let out a shrill, piercing sound, a noise that felt like it came from somewhere else, somewhere far away. And yet, it was right there. He stared at it. It rang again, and again, and again. He didn't want to pick it up, but his hand moved anyway, like something else was making him. He pressed the receiver to his ear, didn't breathe, didn't speak. And then, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here, Henry." A chill rushed down his spine. The voice was wrong. Software empty, like a breath stolen from a dead throat. The room tilted. The walls seemed closer, and in the reflection of the TV, something stood behind him. He turned too fast. But the room was empty, or at least, it should have been, because the bed was wrong. The sheets had been pristine moments ago. Now they were pulled back, like someone had just gotten up, like they had been laying there, waiting for him. Henry's pulse slammed against his ribs. Something moved, not in front of him, not in the mirror, in the closet. The door was open an inch. It had been closed when he walked in. A slow creak echoed in the room. The door opened wider. A breath of warm air brushed his neck, and then a whisper. So close, right against his ear. "You have to let me out." Henry staggered back. His breath hitched. The phone fell from his hand. The dial spun wildly, and the moment it hit the ground, the closet door slammed open. The room plunged into darkness. The light flickered. The TV glitched, and in the mirror, a figure stepped forward, tall, too tall, limbs stretched like a puppet on broken strings. And when it opened its mouth, Henry knew what it had been waiting for. The air crackled, the walls shook, and in the reflection, it reached toward him. But it wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a shape. It was him. His own reflection stepped forward. Its mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. Its lips parted, and in his own voice, it whispered, "You have to let me out." Henry ran, slammed his shoulder against the door, ripped it open. The hallway was empty, silent, normal, like nothing had happened. His heart pounded. His hands shook. He turned. Room 13's door was closed, like it had never been open at all. But something was different. Something was wrong. The neon motel sign buzzed, and when Henry looked through the glass of the office window, his own reflection wasn't there. His hands went cold. His breath shallowed. He lifted his hand. The glass should have mirrored him. But it didn't. It showed the motel, the parking lot, room 13, but not him. And in the hallway behind him, the phone started ringing again. The phone rang, sharp, piercing. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, rattling the air inside the motel office. Henry stood there, frozen. His reflection was still missing from the glass. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the hallway. The phone at the front desk would not stop ringing. His breath came fast now, his pulse hammering at his temples. The motel had always been quiet at this hour, but now it was waiting. His fingers hovered over the receiver. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to hear whatever was on the other end. But the moment he reached for it, the ringing stopped. A breath of silence. Then, from the hallway, a creak. Slow, heavy. The sound of a door opening. Henry turned sharply. The hallway stretched before him, empty, still. But at the very end, the door to room 13 was open, a sliver, just enough to see inside. The neon motel sign buzzed outside, casting the hallway in a flickering red glow. The air was thick now, like a room with too many people in it, but there was no one else here. There was only him, and the room that was waiting. Henry took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His own reflection was still gone from the motel glass. That wasn't possible. It wasn't real. It wasn't. The static from the front lobby TV spiked, louder, sharper, like something was trying to push through, like something was breaking in. And then, from inside room 13, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here, Henry." His heart slammed into his ribs. His feet wanted to move, run, get out, drive until this place was nothing but a speck in the rearview mirror. But his body didn't listen. His hand lifted. Fingers brushed against the door. Warm, like someone had just been here, like someone was still inside. His breath hitched. Something in the back of his mind screamed, "Don't!" but he pushed the door open anyway. The room looked the same as before. Perfectly clean, perfectly wrong. The bed was neatly made, the lamp on, the TV playing static. A suitcase sat in the corner, a guest's suitcase. Someone had checked in. But there was no one here. Henry's fingers trembled as he stepped inside. The suitcase was open, neatly packed clothes, a toothbrush, a wallet. He reached for it, flipping it open with numb hands. The ID inside. His breath caught. Paul Whitaker. The guest who had checked into room 12. The one who had disappeared. Henry staggered back. His vision blurred, his pulse hammered. Paul Whitaker was gone. Hadn't checked out. Hadn't left. But his things were here. Inside room 13. Like the motel had kept them. Like it had kept him. A slow, crawling horror settled in Henry's bones. The room was still. But he could feel it. Something else was here. Watching. Waiting. The walls felt closer. The air felt thicker. And then, the closet door creaked open. Just an inch. And inside, a whisper. Software. Close. You have to let me out. Henry's breath hitched. His legs locked. Something shifted inside the closet. Not footsteps. Not movement. Something stretching. Something unfolding. A shadow slithered across the carpet, cast by something just out of sight. The neon sign outside flickered, and for a split second, Henry swore he saw a hand. Too long. Too thin. Fingers curling around the edge of the closet door. He stumbled back, grabbing the suitcase. As soon as his fingers closed around the handle, the whisper turned into a scream. The walls shook. The closet door slammed open. The lights flickered violently, and in the dark space between the doors, something was there. A figure. Tall. Thin. A shape barely holding itself together. Like a man. But not a man. Its limbs stretched wrong. Its head tilted too far. And when it opened its mouth, no sound came out. Just static. Just emptiness. Just a hole where a person should have been. And then it moved. Henry threw himself back. His body slammed into the nightstand, knocking the lamp to the floor. The bulb burst, sending shards of light across the carpet. The shadows twisted, shifted. The thing in the closet stepped forward, but it wasn't stepping. It was pulling itself, dragging itself, like something was forcing it out, like it had been waiting for him. And in the dark, in the flickering neon light, Henry saw its face, his own. A rush of cold air exploded through the room. The walls shuddered. The TV glitched. And Henry saw himself standing at the threshold of the closet, mouth open, eyes empty, but smiling. And then, the thing whispered in his own voice, "You have to let me out." Henry ran, shoved past the bed. His shoulder slammed into the doorframe as he barreled out into the hallway. His vision blurred. His pulse was a thunderous roar in his ears. Behind him, the motel groaned. The walls shifted. The neon sign outside buzzed and died. He ran into the lobby, chest heaving, hands shaking. And when he looked up, Frankie was standing at the front desk, watching him, silent, expression blank, like he had been expecting this. Henry's breath shook. His hands trembled as he set the suitcase down on the counter. His voice came out raw. "What the hell is in that room, Frankie?" Frankie's face was pale. His hands curled into fists on the desk, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, final. Not what. He swallowed hard, and when he met Henry's eyes, it was the first time Henry had ever seen fear in them. "Who?" Henry's breath was still uneven. The motel felt too quiet, the walls too thin, the air too dense. Room 13 was behind him now, but he could still feel it, like something had followed him out, like something was still watching. Frankie didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't move. His words lingered in the thick air between them. Not what. Who? Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. His fingers curled against the counter, nails pressing hard against the wood. His voice came out hoarse. You knew. It wasn't a question. Frankie nodded slowly. I tried to warn you. Henry felt his stomach twist. You've worked here for years. Why didn't you leave? Frankie finally looked away. His jaw tensed. And when he spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. Because it doesn't let go. Henry stared at him. His skin felt cold. His fingers still trembled from what he had seen. The figure. His own face staring back at him from the closet. The whisper. You'll have to let me out. He forced himself to breathe. His pulse was still hammering. And for the first time, he realized something. Frankie looked tired. Not just exhausted, but drained, like he had been carrying something for far too long, something that wasn't his to carry, or maybe something that was. Frankie exhaled slowly, then he slid a folded piece of paper across the counter, a yellowed newspaper clipping. Old, crumpled. The ink faded. Henry hesitated, then he picked it up, unfolded it with shaking hands, and he froze. The headline read, Hotelier vanishes from Crimson Pines, no trace left behind. Beneath it, a photograph. A man, grey hair, a sharp gaze. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It was his uncle, the man who had left him the motel. And beneath the image, a date. Nitin Sitito. His mouth went dry. This is a joke. His voice was tight. He looked up at Frankie, his pulse pounding behind his eyes. Frankie didn't smile, didn't blink. He just whispered, voice hollow. No, Calloway, this is the price. The words settled like a weight in Henry's chest. The motel wasn't his uncle's inheritance, it was his debt. Henry felt sick. His fingers trembled as he set the paper down, his heart beat too loud in his ears. The motel had been in his family for decades. He had always thought it was just business, just a place that had been passed down. But now he knew better. His uncle hadn't left the motel to him. He had given it to him, passed it down, because he had no other choice, because someone always had to own it, because someone always had to stay. Henry took a slow breath. His mind was unraveling. He could still hear that voice, his own voice, whispering from the closet. You have to let me out. His stomach twisted. He looked at Frankie. His voice was barely audible. How do I stop this? Frankie's face was grim. His fingers drummed against the counter. Slow, measured. And then he said, You don't. Henry stiffened. His jaw locked. Frankie met his gaze. And for the first time, Henry saw it. The truth. The thing Frankie had been trying not to say. And then, softly, Frankie spoke the words that would haunt Henry forever. There's only one way out, Calloway. A pause. Then, you have to find someone else. The motel was silent. The old neon light outside flickered softly. A distant hum, like it was waiting, like it was listening, like it was hungry. Henry's hands shook. His breath was sharp. His pulse thundered in his skull. Frankie's words rang in his ears. You have to find someone else. He felt it then. A sick, curling feeling in his stomach, a realization that settled deep in his bones. This wasn't a business. It was a trap, and Henry was caught in it. He turned away, stepped toward the door. His feet felt heavy, like something wanted him to stay, like something was pulling at him. Frankie didn't stop him, didn't say another word. He just watched, like he had seen this moment before, like he knew exactly what Henry would do next. And maybe he did. Henry reached his truck. The keys felt too heavy in his palm, his hands still shaking. His reflection in the window was warped, like the glass didn't know how to show him properly, like it was still deciding what he was. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat. The engine rumbled to life beneath him. The headlights cut through the dark. The empty road stretched ahead, and for the briefest moment, he thought he could leave, that he could just drive and never look back, that he could forget about room 13, forget about the whispers, forget about the thing that had worn his face, forget the truth. Then he saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing in the motel window, watching him, waiting, smiling, and Henry knew. He had a choice: leave or find someone else. Find someone who wouldn't be missed. Someone who would check in, but never check out. Someone who could take his place, because he finally understood. The motel always needed a guest. Always. And it never forgot who it let go. The road stretched ahead of him, long and empty. Henry gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. His breath was uneven, his pulse hammering like a warning bell in his chest. The motel was behind him now. And yet, it wasn't. His hands were still shaking. His mind replayed Frankie's words over and over, looping them in his head like a broken record. There's only one way out, Calloway. You have to find someone else. He had thought he could drive away, that he could escape the same way he had arrived. But the moment his tires hit the highway, the moment he left Crimson Pines in his rearview mirror, he felt it, a pull, a whisper, a thread deep in his chest, stretching all the way back to the motel. The thought hit him like ice in his veins. The motel was still inside him. Even as he left, even as the neon lights faded in the distance, it wasn't letting go. Not yet. Not unless he gave it something else. Not unless he found someone else. Henry's hands tightened on the wheel, his breathing shallow. He thought of room 13, of the whispers, the figure in the mirror, the suitcase. Paul Whitaker's name scratched into the ledger. He had never left. Henry had walked past that room every day for months, and never once did he think to question why it was never empty, until it had been his turn to stay, until the motel had called his name. His stomach turned. His grip on the wheel tightened. He knew what he had to do. And the worst part, somewhere deep inside, a part of him already wanted to. Miles passed. The road was nothing but black asphalt and distant headlights. His body ached. His mind screamed. And then, up ahead, a diner, small, flickering neon sign, and a single figure standing outside, thumb out, looking for a ride. Henry's pulse slowed. The motel's pull grew stronger. His hands stopped shaking. Because now, he had found someone. The man was young, 25, maybe. Backpack slung over one shoulder, face weary but hopeful as Henry's truck slowed beside him. He bent down, peering through the window. "Where you headed?" he asked. His voice was casual, relaxed, because he had no idea what he was stepping into. Henry forced a smile. "Tired," he said instead. "Got a motel not far from here. You can crash for the night." The hitchhiker hesitated, and for the briefest second, Henry thought he might say no. But then, the kid smiled back. "Yeah," he said. "That'd be great. Thanks, man." The kid climbed in. The doors shut, and Henry turned the truck around, back toward Crimson Pines, back toward room 13, back toward the thing that was waiting for him. They drove in silence for a while. The hitchhiker relaxed. Henry, gripping the wheel, trying not to let his thoughts swallow him whole. It would be easy. Check him into room 13. Walk away. Cross out his own name in the ledger. Write down someone else's. And then he would be free. Wouldn't he? The hitchhiker broke the silence. "What's the place like?" Henry's throat felt dry. He forced himself to speak. "Quiet," he said. "Not many guests." The kid nodded. "I like quiet." A pause, and then, "That's your place. The motel." Henry hesitated. It was, and it wasn't. It was his trap, and soon, it would be this kid's too. The neon sign appeared in the distance. Red, buzzing softly, flickering, vacancy. The motel was waiting. The moment they pulled into the lot, Henry felt it, a shift in the air. The motel recognized him, welcomed him back. It had let him go, on the condition that he returned with someone else. The hitchhiker grabbed his backpack. Henry stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. His body felt too light, like he had already started to disappear, like his name was already fading from the motel's memory. He led the hitchhiker to the front desk. The air pressed down. The shadows stretched. Henry's breath was shallow as he grabbed the keys. And when he looked down at the motel ledger, his name was already fading, flickering, like it had never been written at all. The hitchhiker smiled. "Guess I'll turn in early. Long day." Henry nodded, slid the key across the counter, watched as the kid picked it up. Room 13, waiting for its new guest. The kid walked toward the hallway, his footsteps light, unaware. Henry's hands trembled, his pulse raced. This was it. One more step, one more door closing, and he would be free. Wouldn't he? The kid reached the door, slid the key into the lock, turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Henry's breath caught, because this time he saw it, for the briefest moment, a figure standing inside, waiting, smiling. And when the door clicked shut, the neon sign outside flickered, the air eased, the motel sighed, and Henry felt the thread snap. The next morning, room 13 was booked again. The ledger showed a new name. Henry's was gone, like he had never been there at all, like he had finally checked out. He stepped outside. The air was crisp. His truck was still there, waiting for him. He took one last look at the motel, at the flickering neon, at the red glow painting the gravel beneath his feet, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No pull, no whispers, no fear, because the motel had someone else now, and Henry Calloway was finally free, or so he thought, because in the back of his mind, a whisper still lingered, a voice, software familiar, his own. "You have to let me out." Henry drove. The sun should have been rising by now, but the horizon remained dark. The sky stretched on, empty and endless, like he was driving through a place that no longer existed. But he had done it. The motel was behind him. Room 13 had a new guest. His name was gone from the ledger. And he was free, wasn't he? His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Something still felt wrong, like a weight pressing against his chest, like the motel was still watching him. The radio crackled. Henry didn't remember turning it on. At first, it was nothing but static. Then, a voice, software barely above a whisper. "You have to let me out." Henry's stomach dropped. His hands locked on the wheel. Number. That wasn't possible. The motel was gone. He was gone. His name had faded from the ledger. He had left. Hadn't he? The voice whispered again. "You have to let me out." And this time, it sounded like him. A spike of terror shot through Henry's chest. His throat went dry. His reflection in the windshield wasn't moving. He slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop on the empty highway. His breath came sharp, ragged. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. His hands trembled as he looked up at the rearview mirror. And that was when he saw it. The motel. Behind him. Exactly where it had been. Exactly as it had always been. Like he had never left at all. His pulse pounded. His vision blurred. He grabbed the door handle, shoved it open, stepped out onto the pavement, his legs weak beneath him. And when he turned around, his truck was gone. No engine, no headlights, just the motel. Standing at the edge of the road, waiting. The neon vacancy sign buzzed, flickering red. The air hummed, the wind whispered, and in the front window, a figure was watching him, a reflection, his own reflection. Henry stumbled back. His chest tightened. His own face stared at him from the glass. But it was wrong. The smile was too wide. The eyes were too dark. And then, from the motel's front desk, the phone rang. Sharp, piercing, exactly at 3:13 a.m. Henry couldn't breathe. He had escaped. He had found someone else. He had checked out, hadn't he? The door to room 13 opened, a sliver, a fraction of an inch, just enough to see inside, and then a whisper. Software close. "You shouldn't be here, Henry." His chest seized. He turned, ran. The ground beneath him stretched. The road looped. He didn't make it 10 steps before he was standing right where he started, in front of the motel, exactly where he had always been. His body shook. He backed away, breathing hard. The figure in the window mirrored him, every movement, every breath, and then it stepped forward, not in the reflection, not in the glass, but in the doorway, right in front of him. Henry's throat closed, his own face, his own body, standing inches away, looking at him with empty black eyes. The thing that had been waiting, the thing that had worn his name. And then it smiled, it raised a hand, and offered him the key. Room 13, waiting, just for him. Henry stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he choked out. "No, I left." The thing just tilted its head, like it didn't understand, like it was waiting for him to realize. And in that moment, Henry knew. He had never really left. His name had never faded. The ledger had lied. The motel had never let him go, because he had never checked out, because no one ever did. The neon sign flickered again. The motel sighed. And then the key in the thing's hand turned to ink, dark, dripping, bleeding down its palm, and Henry felt it, felt the weight of something closing in, felt the cold, dark walls of room 13 wrapping around him, felt himself being pulled back inside. His lungs seized, his body went cold, and as he gasped, as he tried to scream, he saw his own reflection one last time, saw the truth. The motel had never needed another guest. It had never needed someone new. It had just needed him, to come back, to remember, to realize. He had always been part of it, that he had always been inside. And now, finally, it was time to close the door. The cycle continues. The motel remains, and room 13 is still waiting. Would you like me to start working on a possible sequel? Blast off.
Was Henry ever really free? Or did the motel trick him into taking someone else's place, only to trap him again? If you had been in Henry's shoes, would you have sacrificed someone else to escape? Comment your theories below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.